Hello and good evening. I'm Melissa Idris. You're watching Consider This. This is the show where we want you to consider and then reconsider what you know of the news of the day. The amendments to the Penal Code and the Criminal Procedure Code to list stalking as a crime were recently tabled in Dewan Rakyat for its first reading. Now, more commonly referred to as the Anti-stalking Bill, the proposed changes stand to make stalking a crime, a criminal offence, with punishments including up to 3 years imprisonment and fines. So what does this bill entail, and will it be sufficient in protecting Malaysians against stalking behaviours? Let's find out more from Datuk Mas Ermiyati Samsudin. She is Deputy Minister in the Prime Minister's Department in charge of Parliament and Law. Datuk, thank you so much for joining us on the show today. You tabled these amendments for its first reading. This is really a step towards making stalking a crime. Can you begin perhaps just by telling us a little bit of why you feel the anti-stalking law is needed to protect Malaysians from stalking behaviours?
Yeah, thank you, Melissa, and Consider This. Thank you for inviting me today. As we know, stalking is very harmful, especially for the survivors, also the victims, and it's widespread in Malaysia. And stalking is very scary, and also can also escalate to further harm and even murder if not stopped. And a study by WAO with the recent market research company Fast.ai found that over a third of Malaysians, including 39% of women, have experienced stalking that make them feel afraid and insecure. And I've heard directly from the women who have moved house and changed their jobs and just to try and escape their stalkers. And many of these survivors are still living in fear as they are still being stalked. And currently, existing laws in Malaysia does not directly address stalking and are not enough to protect Malaysians from stalking. That's why this anti-stalking law is very important, and we need to pass it into law as soon as possible. The law against stalking is crucial as it fills gaps in the domestic violence, and plus enacting these stalking laws will be straightforward and well received and will resolve many problems.
Okay, all right. So there are some laws to address stalking, but clearly it's insufficient. There are gaps. Can I just ask you? I mean, I understand that the process of getting this law ready and to be tabled was a long time. It's been a long time. Can you tell us a little bit about some of the challenges that you faced in getting this bill ready for its first tabling?
Well, I would say that actually there's an effort way back in 2013 when there are few cases arise, but Malaysian public has long concern about this stalking, and more countries enacted these specific stalking offences. And the initiative make stalking a crime started in year 2019 officially, and now we are in the year of 2022. 3 years has passed to come this far, and a committee was set up to discuss on this anti-stalking. And numbers of engagement have been made to this day, and we already have engagement with the various party before making the necessary amendments, and engagement with the government agencies, NGO, CSO, and the victim itself. There are so many parties involved, and usually after the engagement, there will be a few amendments. That is the process. And in fact, although this bill has passed its first reading, there will be areas that can be improved to be added to the law, because during the engagement, there are so many input that we get from during the engagement that we need from the lawyers, from the any parties who involved. And while this is in progress, thousands of victims being stalked in a year who waited for stalking to become a crime and act can be taken to the stalker. Well, I can say time is very crucial.
Definitely. So I understand this bill is going to be debated and voted hopefully in the next parliamentary sitting, which will convene at the end of October. Do you think that in the meantime that you will be having more of these stakeholder engagements, as you said, to take on some of the feedback? I'm wondering what feedback you've received so far since the first tabling, the first reading.
Yeah, that's why when I had my first engagement, I think last year, Melissa, I think that was the first time when I heard the story about the victims and also the survivors, and it shocked me a lot. And then it makes my heart so emotional when you heard to their stories and bad stories, and they attempted to suicide. And what can I say, from that day, I said to myself, no, we must get this thing, anti-stalking, to be done as soon as possible. And I spoke to the minister, and Datuk Sri Dr. Wan Junaidi is very supportive about this. About this effort, and I had a very good team at Bahyu, and also I work closely with the NGO, and that's why I can say this: NGO, law expert, government agencies, lawyers, and other stakeholders are all agreed that we need this anti-stalking law for Malaysia. And the proposal for this law was developed by a committee comprising government agencies, including Bahyu, PDRM, and the Bar Council itself. And I would like to thank you to Women's AIDS Organization, WAO, and everyone involved to initiate this. I came 2021 for under the JPM, Jabatan Perdana Menteri Bahagian Haluan Undang, Parlimen dan Undang-Undang. And this law, I think, is right on time, and we need this. And the law had garnered support from various parties, in addition to a champion by the government. And I hope to work with MPs between now and the second reading to see if how the bill can improve further, and of course pass into law without delay. And another round engagement will be held as soon as possible with the NGO in near time, to make sure that every stakeholder know their roles and fighting against stalking. And engagement with the MPs, not only MPs, but also with the YB Senator, also in our schedule, and everything will be ready before the second reading to be tabled in the next Parliament meeting, I think somewhere October, inshallah.
The Deputy Law Minister, Datuk Mas Irmayati Samsudin there. We're going to take a quick break here and consider this. We will be back with more. Stay tuned. Hi, welcome back to Consider This. I'm Melissa Idris. Let's continue our discussion about the move to criminalize stalking. We are now one step closer to seeing this happen following the first reading of the Anti-stalking Bill in Dewan Rakyat. Now, how much do we understand about stalking behaviours and how they are interrelated to harassment and intimidation? Well, joining us now, we have the managing partner of Speak Up Malaysia. Amelia Sharif is an expert in anti-harassment, anti-bullying and discrimination, and she is a vocal gender rights advocate. Amelia, thanks for joining us today. Do you think that stalking is a difficult behaviour to define? And how is it related to harassment and to bullying?
Stalking may be challenging to define, but it is not impossible. Stalking is basically a situation where a person is fixated or obsessed with another person. That's the easiest way to understand stalking. Generally, this can be exhibited by actions or behaviors which disrupt a person's privacy, curtail their freedom, and often leaves the victim feeling scared, unsafe, threatened. Often, laws relating to stalking would describe actions or behaviors associated with stalking, as opposed to attempting to define stalking in itself. Some of these behaviors include, generally, I put them into 5 categories. So, number 1, following a person. Number 2, contacting or attempting to contact a person. And of course, this includes physically, like sending unwanted gifts over and over again, or digitally, when there is calls, texts, messages, emails, DMs on social medias and whatnot. The third category is when you monitor a person, for example, spying on them via a listening device, camera, GPS, and others. Number 4, loitering at a place, private or public, to watch them, observe them, check what they're doing, to get information, etc. And the last category is when you show up uninvited at a person's house, their workplace, their schools, and things like that. The second part of what you asked, Melissa, in terms of whether or not these constitute harassment, stalking definitely is a form of harassment, and it is a form of bullying, because it often create a situation where the victim feels intimidated or scared for their safety, right? So it is a very common tactic to bully and harass another person, but it may or may not form as sexual harassment, depending on whether or not there is a sexual element in the act of bullying, in the act of stalking in itself.
Well, one of the ways I see maybe it relate to sexual harassment is very similar to crimes of sexual violence. Stalking is about power and control. And something you said a little bit earlier struck me. It's about doing these behaviors over and over again. So it's the repetition of these behaviors after the person being stalked has said no, which boils down to the issue of consent, because these behaviors on its own of sending gifts or sending a DM or contacting somebody is not necessarily stalking behavior unless it's done, as you said, over and over again. Can you talk a little bit about the issue of consent and how that relates to stalking behaviors?
So generally, when you talk about consent, there are 5 elements to consent, right? Some of which it has to be enthusiastic, it has to be clear, it has to be specific. So in my experience, stalking doesn't have to happen over and over again. If it's like the second time, or if a boundary has been established from the get-go, violating that boundary, so the first action may itself become an act of stalking, right? So consent works, I think, where there is a very clear boundary that has already been set, or if there is no boundary, then it is an attempt to find out what that boundary is. So when you talk about stalking, it is often the inability to recognize that your behavior may be unwanted, and you don't even check if that person wants that flower that you've been sending them once a week, right? So that's consent is very important in consent. You're very spot on about that.
Okay. Well, can we talk a little bit about the digital age? Because cyber stalking is also a stalking behavior, but it's often, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's often dismissed as less harmful, less dangerous. You know, they say, oh, just block or just disconnect or shut down your account. Is that the way? How are we thinking about cyber stalking, particularly in this day and age when so many of us are connected on social media?
I would agree with that. In fact, I was guilty of this as well. So back then, before we have more knowledge about what stalking is, when we go and check someone out on Instagram or on Facebook, we will use the term stalking very loosely. So we will say, oh, I was just stalking you on social media, and I really admire the work that you do. You know, it's very common for us to use that kind of language, not realizing that it is actually a very serious issue. So similarly on social media, I do think that people take it less lightly to say, oh, someone keep DMing me, as opposed to saying this person keeps showing up in front of my gate at my house. So clearly that's a different severity in terms of both actions. But for me, in terms of recognizing that stalking in itself, it is always about the ability to recognize the impact onto the victim and whether or not that behavior causes any forms of unwanted consequences, right? And not being able to recognize that, I think, lead to us thinking that stalking on social media is not as serious. Sometimes people say it's just a comment, block, as if to dismiss the impact that it had created onto the victim, right? I've also seen situations where people say, you posted a picture of yourself wearing like a short skirt on social media. Of course, you will invite this kind of attention. So now stalking becomes attention that people give you. So there are so many different ways in which people interpret stalking on social media, I think, and it is oftentimes very hard to identify. But I do hope that if the bill were to pass, it would create a bit more information in terms of what would constitute stalking, be it on social media or otherwise.
Thank you so much. Amelia Sharif, Managing Partner of Speak Up Malaysia. We're going to take a quick break here and consider this. We will be back with more. Stay tuned. Hi, I'm Melissa Idris. Thanks so much for staying with me on Consider This. Joining me now is Yu Ren Chung. He is Deputy Executive Director and Advocacy Director for the Women's Aid Organization. Ren Chung, this anti-stalking bill that's been tabled for its first reading, it's been a long time coming. I think many of us don't realize just how long people have been working on this piece, this amendment to the Penal Code and the Criminal Procedure Code. WAO has been highlighting this issue for a while now, and finally we're seeing some progress, some steps in the right direction. Why do you think it's taken this long to move the needle on making stalking a crime?
Well, I think a couple of reasons, Melissa. I think the first reason is just the realization and that it's needed, convincing policymakers that we do need to address stalking specifically. And when we first, most recently, when we raised this, we wrote to a government agency in 2017 asking for them to look into making stalking a crime. And the reply we got was that, it wasn't needed as existing laws were sufficient. And so since then, we've really had to do a lot to work together with survivors to show that, look, these are real people, Malaysians, many are women who have tried to get help after they were being stalked, while they're being stalked, and they were unable to get help. And so slowly, when we started building the case and showing that, look, this is happening to a lot of people, we were able to get more policymakers to get on board. And we're thankful now that all the policymakers we worked with, government agencies across the board, have been very supportive and part of the process towards making this a reality.
Right. I think some of the arguments that have been used to dismiss stalking is that, where is the harm? Where is the harm in stalking? Show us why stalking is dangerous. Can you tell us why stalking is dangerous and the harm that it causes?
So there are two reasons here. I mean, I think two big harms of stalking. The first is, in of itself, stalking is harmful. Studies have shown that stalking causes mental harm, anxiety, depression, of course, fear, guilt, helplessness. These are things that severely affect somebody's day-to-day life. And in a study that WAO, together with research firm VAS.ai, did in 2021, we found that Malaysians who experienced stalking, they had to really change their lives to get around it. Some were unable to focus at work. Some were not safe, didn't feel safe going on public. Some didn't feel safe and could not go to classes, for example, if they were students. And so we really see that stalking itself has a huge negative impact. And speaking to survivors, you'll find that some go to extremes to try to escape stalking. We've spoken to, tried supporting women who they've changed jobs multiple times. They've moved house. Some even move state, or some even move country to try and escape stalking. So we see that stalking itself has really severe impacts on someone's mental health as well as their day-to-day lives. The second thing to highlight is that stalking can escalate. So if we don't stop stalking, it can escalate to further harm, injuries, and even murder. And a study in the United States showed that 90% of murders involving intimate partners was preceded by stalking. And even in Malaysia, we don't have that data. But if you look at any murder case involving, mostly involving partners or former partners, you can read in the story that this person has conducted stalking before they committed the murder. Recently, we found there was a story involving an NGO leader who was slashed. His neck was slashed after he had reported some wrongdoings. And even he says he thinks he was stalked by the individuals before, and so we find that's actually a kind of interesting point to note as well, that when men face stalking, and men do face stalking according to our study, the consequence is usually physical harm after being stalked, whereas women also experience that, but more it affects women in different ways, and more psychologically. So it is harmful, and we need to put an end to it.
Okay, well, the first step is in the reading in Dewan Rakyat. And now that the first reading is done, what are the areas that you and WO have identified that can perhaps be amended or improved before the second reading?
So the bill does two things, essentially. It first creates an offense of stalking. So it defines what it is and sets out a punishment. And it also creates a protection order, so that if you're being stalked, you can get some kind of, the police can stop the stalker from coming near you or from contacting you, and so on. So overall, we think the bill is quite good and robust. WAO has been part of the process and was part of a committee together with government agencies and even the Bar Council to draft initial versions of the bill. But so this final bill is something that the government produced. Overall, it's quite robust, but we do have three recommendations as to how we feel the bill can be improved before it's passed. So our message to MPs is that, let's take a look at the bill. It's good. We should support it. But, can we try and push for further tweaks to the bill to make it as best as possible? So what are those three recommendations? The first is the bill as it is currently defines stalking as something that is an act of harassment, and there's a list of examples of what could be an act of harassment, for example, following you, contacting you, and so on. That action, if you do one of those acts and it causes a distress, fear, or alarm to your safety, and if that action is repeated, meaning 2 or more times, that is what the bill defines as stalking. So what we're saying is that, okay, in addition to being repeated, so this is actually a key point, because stalking is a course of conduct. It is not usually a one-off incident. It's usually somebody has followed you, someone has contacted you multiple times, someone has sent you 10, 20 messages, someone has gone to social media and created multiple accounts to try and contact you. So that is usually what stalking is. And the bill has this term repeated, which is very important. But we're also saying, look, in addition to repeated, there are also some cases where the stalking is one-off, but it is continuous. So for example, maybe you're being followed from your house all the way to wherever it is you're going, to your workplace or a shop or your university or so on. And that person is following you for half an hour, 1 hour, 2 hours. So that may be one action, but it is an action that's continuous. And we're saying this is also a common form of stalking that is important for us to stop. And if you look at laws in other countries, Singapore, UK, New Zealand, and so on, they do have this concept of one-off actions that are protracted or continuous. So that's the first recommendation. The second recommendation is we're saying that looking at the list of examples. So normally it's clearer if laws include a list of acts that can be considered stalking under certain circumstances. So this bill, it does that. It lists 4 things that can be, or acts that are usually associated with stalking. So it says following you around, contacting you by any means, loitering around your house or at your workplace, or sending you anything, or gifts or any items or anything, it says. So these are the 4 things that the bill currently lists. And these are good things. It's good that the list is there, but we're saying, hey, there are other actions. There are other examples that we should also include as examples. And the list isn't a closed list, so just to note that those are just examples. But in order for it to be as clear as possible, we're saying let's also include 3 more things in this list. The first is doxing, or publishing a statement about you or purportedly from you. So for example, somebody may post on their own Facebook. They may not tag you or even mention you, but it may be a picture of your house, or it may be your address, or maybe a statement that you said, a message that you sent, or maybe they may create an account and say they are you and then publish something. And these are ways to either contact you or get to you. So that's the first. Second is interfering with property. So maybe somebody comes to somewhere that you frequent, your house or whatever it is, and they change around move around your furniture to send a message to you that I've been here. That is another example. The third thing we think we should add to the list is monitoring or spying. So someone who is watching you, or they might not be following you physically, but they may be monitoring you in other ways or spying on you through other ways. So we're saying add these 3 things to the list of examples, and these are 3 things that, number 1 are common forms of stalking behavior,
Okay.
and number 2, again, if we look at laws in other countries, these things are very common, and they're included in Singapore, UK.
All right, thank you so much. Yuren Chung there from WO, wrapping up this episode of Consider This. I'm Melissa Idris, signing off for the evening. Thank you so much for watching, and good night.